The janitor's baby rejected every embrace until she clung to the billionaire as if she'd known him forever. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower held secrets in its marble corridors, but none as profound as the one crying in the arms of a woman who cleaned its offices every night. Margaret Santos pushed her cart through the executive wing at 2:47 a.m., the wheels squeaking against polished stone that reflected her weathered face like a distorted mirror. She had worked these halls for 3 years, invisible to the people who owned them, visible only to the security cameras that tracked her every movement. Her hands, rough from chemicals and years of labor, gripped the cart handle with the same determination that had carried her across 2 borders and through countless rejections. The sound reached her before she saw anything, a thin, desperate wail that seemed to echo from the glass walls themselves. Margaret paused, her heart recognizing something her mind couldn't yet name. She followed the sound past empty conference rooms where million-dollar decisions were made by day, past offices lined with awards that meant nothing to her, until she reached the corner suite that belonged to Alexander Whitmore. The door was slightly ajar, unusual for a building where security protocols were religion. Margaret hesitated. In 3 years, she had learned the unspoken rules: clean efficiently, remain unseen, ask no questions. But the crying continued, growing weaker now, as if the small voice was losing hope of being heard. She pushed the door open with trembling fingers. There, nestled in the leather seat of a chair that cost more than her annual salary, was a baby, 6 months old, perhaps less, wrapped in a blanket so white it seemed to glow under the city lights streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The infant's face was flushed from crying, tiny fists beating the air in frustration or fear. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The scent hit her immediately: talcum powder and warm milk, innocent and pure in a space designed for cold calculations. Her body moved before her mind could protest, muscle memory from a grief she thought she had buried taking control. She lifted the baby with hands that remembered this weight, this fragility. The crying stopped instantly, replaced by wide eyes that seemed to study Margaret's face with impossible recognition. The silence that followed was louder than any sound the building had ever contained. Margaret's chest tightened as she looked down at the child. The baby's features were delicate, undefined in the way of all newborns, but there was something in those dark eyes that reminded her of another face, another time. Her son would have been 7 now if the hospital had been better equipped, if she had been able to afford private care, if the world had been just a little kinder to women like her. The memory crashed over her like a wave. Sterile hospital walls, machines that beeped too slowly, too quietly, until they stopped altogether. She had held him for exactly 17 minutes before the nurses took him away. 17 minutes to last a lifetime. Now, in this temple of wealth and power, she held another child who had been abandoned, left to cry alone in a space where human warmth was as foreign as poverty. The irony wasn't lost on her, but the pain was too immediate for bitter laughter. Margaret rocked gently, the motion as natural as breathing. Somewhere in those lights were families sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that in this tower of ambition, a cleaning woman was falling in love with a mystery that would change everything. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of elevators and the soft breathing of a child who had finally found what she was looking for, someone who understood that being unwanted wasn't the same as being unloved. The elevator descended through 42 floors of steel and glass, carrying Margaret and the baby toward a world that would demand explanations she didn't have. The baby settled against her shoulder, finding comfort in the rhythm that had once soothed her own child. Through the window, Manhattan stretched endlessly, lights twinkling like stars that had fallen too close to Earth. Each floor that passed felt like a step deeper into unknown territory, where good intentions collided with legal realities and the simple act of caring became complicated by systems designed to protect rather than nurture. The security guard at the lobby desk looked up as the elevator doors opened. His name was Robert, and in 3 years of nightly encounters, he had never seen Margaret carry anything more personal than her worn leather purse. Now she approached his station with a bundle in her arms that transformed her from invisible worker to something that demanded attention. "Mrs. Santos." Robert's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man trained to notice irregularities. "Is there something I should know about?" Margaret's English, still colored by the rhythms of her childhood, became more pronounced under stress. "I found her. In the office upstairs. She was alone, crying." The words felt inadequate, unable to convey the recognition that had passed between her and the child, the way the baby had settled against her as if coming home. Robert reached for his radio, protocol demanding that he report unusual circumstances, but something in Margaret's posture, protective, fierce, maternal, made him pause. He had daughters of his own, and he recognized the look of a woman who had found something worth fighting for. "How long ago?" he asked, his hand still hovering over the radio. 20 minutes, maybe less." Margaret adjusted her hold on the baby, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder with the complete trust that only children possessed. There was no one else, no note, nothing, just her. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken questions. Robert knew the building's routines better than anyone, every entrance, every exit, every person who belonged and those who didn't. Someone had brought this child here deliberately, choosing a place where she would be found, but not immediately claimed. It suggested planning, resources, access. It suggested someone with power and the knowledge to use it. "We have to call the authorities," Robert said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. They both knew what would happen next. The child would disappear into a system overwhelmed by need and understaffed by design. Margaret would return to her mop and her cart, and this moment would become just another incident report filed away in some bureaucrat's cabinet. Margaret's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she agreed, because anything else would have been naive. But her body language told a different story. She turned slightly, shielding the baby from Robert's view, as if protecting her from the very system meant to help. The next hour passed in a blur of phone calls and forms. Social workers arrived with practiced efficiency, their kind but tired faces reflecting years of similar scenes. They examined the baby with gentle professionalism, while Margaret answered questions in a voice that grew smaller with each inquiry. Did she know anything about the child's background? No? Had she seen anyone unusual in the building that night? No. Would she be able to provide temporary care while permanent placement was arranged? The question hung in the air like a prayer half-spoken. Margaret's apartment was 15 blocks away, a fourth-floor walk-up in a neighborhood where dreams went to be practical. It contained exactly what a life lived paycheck to paycheck could afford: furniture that served its purpose, photographs of family left behind, and the kind of careful cleanliness that came from understanding how quickly dignity could be lost. The social worker, a young woman named Jennifer whose idealism hadn't yet been completely eroded by the system, looked around with eyes that tried not to judge. She saw the spotless kitchen, the small but organized living space, the cross hanging above a couch that had seen better decades. What she didn't see was the empty bedroom that Margaret kept closed, the one that had been prepared for a child who never came home. "The paperwork will take some time," Jennifer explained, her voice gentle but honest. "Emergency foster care requires background checks, home evaluations. It's not a quick process." Margaret nodded, understanding that bureaucracy moved at its own pace, indifferent to the needs of those caught in its machinery. She looked down at the baby in her arms, still sleeping with the abandon that spoke of deep trust. "How long?" she asked. "A few days, maybe a week. We'll need to place her in emergency care until—" "I can keep her," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I have experience with children. I can provide what she needs. Jennifer's training told her to be cautious, to follow protocols designed by people who had never held an abandoned baby at 3 in the morning. But her instincts, honed by years of seeing children passed between strangers, recognized something rare, genuine love offered without expectation of return. They worked through the paperwork until dawn, painted the windows grey, turning Margaret's small apartment into something that felt more like home than it had in years. When Jennifer finally left, promising to return with more forms and questions, Margaret found herself alone with a sleeping child and a responsibility that terrified and completed her in equal measure. Alexander Whitmore arrived at his office at precisely 7:30 a.m., as he had every weekday for the past 12 years. His routine was a carefully orchestrated performance of control. Italian leather shoes that made no sound on marble floors, a handshake that conveyed authority without aggression, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes but served its purpose in boardrooms where billions changed hands on the strength of confidence alone. His assistant, Victoria Kane, intercepted him at the elevator with the efficiency that had made her indispensable to 3 CEOs over 15 years. Her silver hair was pulled back in a style that suggested competence without severity, and her navy suit bore the kind of subtle tailoring that whispered, rather than shouted, wealth. "There was an incident last night," she said, her voice carefully modulated to convey information without alarm. "Building security found the cleaning staff with an infant. Apparently discovered in your office." Alexander's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition that lasted exactly long enough for Victoria to notice and catalogue for future reference. In her years of managing the careful choreography of power, she had learned to read the micro-expressions that revealed more than words ever could. "An infant," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. "Approximately 6 months old. No identification, no apparent connection to anyone in the building. The authorities were contacted, of course." Victoria paused, studying her employer's face with the attention of a chess player calculating 3 moves ahead. The cleaning woman, Margaret Santos, was granted temporary custody. They rode the elevator in silence, ascending through floors where other people's lives were reduced to quarterly reports and profit margins. Alexander stared at his reflection in the polished steel doors, seeing a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of emotional distance. His success had been built on the ability to make decisions without sentiment, to treat human resources as exactly that, resources to be optimized, not relationships to be nurtured. But as they reached the 42nd floor, something pulled at the edges of his consciousness. The memory was fragmented, more feeling than image, the sound of crying that had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through his dreams until he woke at 4 a.m. with a sense of loss he couldn't name. His office looked exactly as it always did. The leather chair where Margaret had found the baby showed no sign of disturbance. The windows still framed Manhattan like a painting of ambition realized. Yet something fundamental had shifted, as if the very air held traces of talcum powder and innocence that didn't belong in a space dedicated to the acquisition of power. Victoria lingered in the doorway, her practiced eye cataloguing details. "Shall I arrange for additional security screening? The fact that someone gained access to your private office suggests a breach in protocol." Alexander moved to his desk, running his fingers along its edge with uncharacteristic uncertainty. The surface was immaculate, polished to a mirror shine that reflected nothing but his own hands, yet he could swear he smelled something sweet and clean, utterly foreign to the environment of cologne and leather that defined his professional world. "No," he said finally, "that won't be necessary." Victoria's eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch, the equivalent of a shout from someone who had mastered the art of controlled expression. "Sir, I feel I should point out that the security implications. I said no. The words came out sharper than intended, carrying an edge that made Victoria step back involuntarily. Alexander had built his reputation on measured responses, on never revealing more than he intended. The fact that he was showing emotion over what should have been a simple security matter suggested depths she had never suspected. She withdrew without another word, leaving Alexander alone with the silence that had been his companion for so many years. He tried to focus on the reports, waiting for his attention, the meetings that would shape the futures of companies and careers. But his eyes kept drifting to the chair where a stranger's child had been found, where someone had made a choice that defied logic and spoke to something deeper than rational thought. The morning passed in a blur of conference calls and decisions that felt suddenly hollow. Alexander found himself distracted by details that had never mattered before. The way sunlight moved across his office floor, the distant sound of construction that spoke of growth and change, the persistent feeling that something important had been left unsaid or undone. It wasn't until his lunch meeting was cancelled that he found himself alone again, staring out at a city that stretched beyond the horizon. Somewhere in those streets was a cleaning woman who had risked everything to care for a child she had never seen before. The thought disturbed him in ways he couldn't articulate, challenging assumptions about human nature that had guided his life for 4 decades. He picked up his phone twice before setting it down again. There were protocols for these situations, appropriate channels through which concerned citizens expressed interest in charitable causes. But the idea of reducing this to a tax-deductible donation felt like a betrayal of something he couldn't name. As afternoon shadows lengthened across his office, Alexander made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew him. He called his driver and gave an address in a neighborhood he had never visited, where a woman named Margaret Santos was learning to love someone else's abandoned dream. Margaret's building stood like a testament to endurance rather than prosperity. Red brick worn smooth by decades of weather, fire escapes that zigzagged down its face like metallic scars, and windows that framed lives lived close to the bone but with stubborn dignity. Alexander's driver hesitated at the curb, the black sedan as out of place as a tuxedo at a construction site. "Wait here," Alexander said, stepping onto pavement that crunched with urban grit beneath his Italian leather soles. He had never walked these streets before, never breathed air that carried the mingled scents of laundry hanging from fire escapes and food cooking in kitchens where every dollar was counted twice. The lobby smelled of cleaning supplies and something indefinably human, the accumulated essence of lives lived in close quarters, where privacy was a luxury and community formed by necessity rather than choice. Alexander climbed 4 flights of stairs, his breathing slightly labored, his usual confidence eroded by the unfamiliarity of the environment. Margaret opened the door on the second knock, wariness etched in the lines around her eyes, until she recognized him. Her expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and finally settled into something resembling protective caution. Behind her, Alexander caught a glimpse of a small apartment that radiated the kind of cleanliness that spoke of pride rather than privilege. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that powerful people rarely brought good news to her neighborhood. "Mrs. Santos." He stood in the doorway, like a man who had rehearsed a speech, but forgotten the opening lines. I came to see if—" The words felt foreign in his mouth, stripped of the corporate polish that usually made communication effortless. From somewhere in the apartment came a sound that stopped his fumbling explanation cold, a baby's laughter, pure and unself-conscious, followed by Margaret's voice, speaking in gentle Spanish. The melody of the language wrapped around words of comfort and love, creating something that Alexander had never heard before, the sound of unconditional acceptance. Margaret stepped aside, a gesture that was part invitation and part challenge. "She's sleeping," she said, leading him into a living room where afternoon light filtered through clean windows, illuminating a scene that defied every assumption he had made about what poverty looked like. The baby lay in a makeshift crib constructed from a drawer lined with soft blankets, her face peaceful in the way that only children could achieve. But it was the details surrounding her that told the real story. A mobile crafted from colorful paper cutouts, bottles arranged with military precision, and toys that were clearly second-hand but clean to perfection. Alexander approached slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter something precious and irreplaceable. The baby stirred at his presence, opening eyes that seemed to look directly into his soul, with the frank assessment that only the very young possessed. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I call her Sophia," Margaret replied, settling into a chair that had seen better decades but still served its purpose. "It means wisdom. She seems to know things, you understand. Things that babies shouldn't know." As if summoned by the sound of her name, Sophia turned her head toward Alexander with deliberate focus. Her tiny hand reached out, fingers opening and closing in the universal gesture of infant desire. Not for food or comfort, but for connection. Without thinking, Alexander extended his index finger toward the reaching hand. The moment Sophia's fingers closed around it, something fundamental shifted in the universe. The baby's grip was surprisingly strong, but it was more than physical contact. It was recognition, acknowledgement, a wordless conversation that bypassed every defense he had built around his heart. Margaret watched this exchange with eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize significance when it appeared. She had witnessed many people meet Sophia over the past 3 days: social workers, neighbors, the pediatrician at the free clinic. None of them had elicited this response, this immediate and total focus that the baby now directed toward Alexander. "She knows you," Margaret said simply, stating a fact that defied logic but couldn't be denied. Alexander found himself kneeling beside the makeshift crib, his expensive suit forgotten, as Sophia's grip anchored him to something he had thought lost forever: the capacity to feel without calculation, to want something that couldn't be bought or negotiated. Her eyes held no judgment, demanded no explanations, offered no conditions. She simply accepted his presence as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For 17 minutes, though he wouldn't realize the significance of that duration until much later, Alexander knelt beside a drawer that had become a cradle, while a baby who belonged to no one held onto his finger as if it were a lifeline. In the silence of that small apartment, surrounded by the evidence of love that had nothing to do with resources and everything to do with choice, he began to understand that the crying he had heard in his dreams wasn't coming from his office. It was coming from a part of himself that had been abandoned so long ago he had forgotten it existed. When Sophia finally released his finger and settled back into sleep, Alexander rose slowly, his knees protesting the unaccustomed position. Margaret watched him with the patient attention of someone who had learned to read people's hearts through their actions rather than their words. "She'll need things," he said finally, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. "Formula, diapers, clothes, a proper crib." Margaret's chin lifted slightly, dignity wrapping around her like armor. "We manage. We always manage." "I didn't mean—" Alexander stopped, recognizing the minefield of class and assumption that stretched between them. "I meant that if you ever needed help, if there was anything—" The silence that followed was filled with unspoken understanding. They both knew this moment had changed something irreversible, created connections that would demand choices neither of them was prepared to make. But for now, in the fading afternoon light of a fourth-floor apartment where love lived in the spaces between hardship and hope, it was enough to stand in the presence of a mystery that had brought them together. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless dance of ambition and survival, unaware that in one small room, 3 lives had just intersected in ways that would reshape everything they thought they knew about family, sacrifice, and the courage required to love without guarantees. 3 weeks into their unlikely arrangement, Margaret had developed a routine that defied every statistic about single mothers in her income bracket. She woke at 5 a.m. to feed Sophia, spent the morning at home until the baby's afternoon nap, then took her to Mrs. Delgado's apartment downstairs before leaving for her night shift. It was a delicate choreography of necessity and love, performed without complaint, because Sophia's laughter had become the soundtrack to a life Margaret hadn't dared to hope for. The baby had grown stronger, more alert, her eyes tracking movement with the focused attention of someone taking careful inventory of her world. She had claimed Margaret's apartment with the confidence of ownership, transforming it from a space of careful solitude into something that breathed with life and possibility. The closed bedroom door remained shut, but its presence no longer felt like a wound. Alexander's visits had become predictable in their irregularity. He appeared at Margaret's door at different times, always carrying something practical: diapers, formula, a thermometer, a soft blanket that cost more than Margaret made in a week. He never stayed long, never imposed, but his presence filled the small apartment with an energy that Sophia responded to immediately. The baby would become animated the moment she heard his voice in the hallway, as if some invisible thread connected them across the barriers of logic and circumstance. On this particular Thursday evening, Alexander arrived carrying a wooden box that he set down with unusual care. Margaret watched from the kitchen, where she was preparing Sophia's evening bottle, as he knelt beside the makeshift crib with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. "I thought she might like music," he said, lifting a small hand-carved music box from the container. The craftsmanship was exquisite: polished wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, hinges that moved with the precision of Swiss engineering. When he wound the key, a gentle melody filled the air, notes that danced around each other like conversations between old friends. Sophia's eyes widened at the sound, her small hands reaching toward the source with determined focus. Alexander placed the music box within her reach, watching as she explored its surface with the systematic curiosity that had become her signature approach to new experiences. "Mozart," Alexander explained, though he spoke to Sophia rather than Margaret. "Lullaby in B-flat major. My mother used to—" He stopped abruptly, as if the words had escaped without permission. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, bottle in hand, her expression gentle but attentive. In 3 weeks of careful conversations, Alexander had revealed almost nothing about his personal history. She knew he was wealthy, powerful, successful, facts that were obvious from his clothes, his car, the way he moved through the world with unconscious authority. But she knew nothing about the man who knelt on her worn carpet, speaking to a baby about memories he clearly guarded like secrets. "She had good taste," Margaret said, settling into her chair as Sophia began to fuss with the preliminary hunger that preceded serious demand for food. Alexander remained kneeling, his fingers tracing the edge of the music box with movements that seemed unconscious. "She died when I was 7, he said, the words emerging as if pulled from some deep well. "Cancer. I barely remember her voice, but I remember this song. She would hum it when she thought I was asleep." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything they had shared in their careful dance around the boundaries of class and circumstance. Margaret lifted Sophia from the crib, settling her into the feeding position that had become as natural as breathing. 7 is old enough to remember love," Margaret said quietly. "Even when everything else becomes unclear, love leaves marks that don't fade." Alexander watched Sophia's small mouth work at the bottle, her eyes drifting closed in the contentment that came with having needs met by someone who understood their urgency. The sight triggered something in his chest, a tightness that felt like recognition and loss combined. "I hired someone to find her parents," he said suddenly, the words emerging without apparent connection to their previous conversation. "The baby's parents, a private investigator, very discreet, someone who specializes in cases like this." Margaret's hand stilled on Sophia's back, the gentle circular motion she had been making suddenly suspended. "And?" "Nothing yet. But he's thorough, patient. He says these things take time, that sometimes the truth is buried under layers of paperwork and privacy. People who abandon children usually have reasons they've thought about carefully." The implications of his words settled between them like smoke from a fire neither of them had intended to light. Margaret had spent 3 weeks building a life around the assumption that Sophia would stay, that the bureaucracy would move slowly enough for love to take root and become undeniable. The idea that someone might be looking for the baby, might have legitimate claim to her, felt like standing on ground that had suddenly revealed itself to be quicksand. "Why?" Margaret asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Alexander's silence stretched long enough to encompass the music box's entire melody cycle before starting again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions made in boardrooms where millions hung on the ability to see several moves ahead. "Because she deserves to know where she comes from. Because whoever left her in my office made a choice that affects more than just her future. It affects yours, mine, everyone who's fallen in love with her. And because—" He paused, watching Sophia's eyelids grow heavy as milk and music combined to create perfect contentment. "Because I've spent 43 years believing that blood is the only thing that makes a family real. Looking at her, at you, at what you've built here in 3 weeks, I'm beginning to think I might have been wrong about everything." The music box wound down slowly, its melody becoming fainter until silence reclaimed the apartment. Sophia had fallen asleep in Margaret's arms, her breathing deep and even, trusting in the way that only children could. But the peace that usually accompanied her sleep felt fragile now, threatened by questions that had answers somewhere in the vast machinery of the city. Margaret looked down at the baby, who had become her daughter in every way that mattered, then across at the man who was paying someone to potentially take her away. The contradiction should have made her angry, but instead she found herself understanding the terrible logic of love, how it demanded both protection and truth even when they pulled in opposite directions. "What if the investigator finds something?" she asked. Alexander's answer came without hesitation, as if he had already considered every possibility. "Then we'll face it together, all of us, because whatever brought Sophia into our lives, she's here now. And that has to mean something." Outside, the city hummed with its endless energy, but inside Margaret's apartment, 3 people sat surrounded by the fragile hope that sometimes the family you choose becomes stronger than the one you're born into, if you're brave enough to fight for it when the time comes. Victoria Kane had built her career on the principle that information was the ultimate currency, more valuable than gold because it could be leveraged, manipulated and deployed with surgical precision when circumstances demanded. She maintained files on everyone who mattered in Alexander's professional orbit, their weaknesses, their ambitions, their pressure points. It was protection disguised as thoroughness, insurance policies written in carefully documented details. The fact that her employer had begun visiting a cleaning woman's apartment troubled her in ways that had nothing to do with professional protocol. Victoria understood men in power, their patterns, their vulnerabilities, their capacity for decisions that could destroy everything they had built. She had watched 3 CEOs navigate scandals, and each time the damage had been contained through careful management of information flow and strategic deployment of resources. But Alexander's behavior defied the usual categories of male midlife crisis. He wasn't seeking younger women, expensive toys, or adrenaline-fueled escapes from responsibility. Instead, he was visiting a 4th-floor walk-up in a neighborhood where his security detail felt exposed, carrying baby supplies like offerings to a shrine he couldn't explain. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator Alexander had hired without consulting her, a breach of protocol that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Thomas Brennan was good at finding things people preferred to keep hidden, discreet enough to work for clients who valued privacy above all else. His message contained only an address and a time, a coffee shop in Soho, where conversations could disappear into the ambient noise of urban anonymity. She arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a table that afforded clear views of the entrance and street beyond. Brennan appeared exactly on time, a man whose unremarkable appearance was his greatest professional asset. He could disappear into any crowd, become invisible in any setting, remembered only when he chose to be. "You have something," Victoria said without preamble, sliding an envelope across the table. Brennan's fees were paid in cash, his services existing in the grey spaces where legal technicalities provided just enough cover for activities that might not bear close scrutiny. "More than something," Brennan replied, producing a manila folder that he kept closed. "The baby, Sophia, your boss has been calling her. She's not a random abandonment. This was planned, orchestrated by someone with access to your building, knowledge of Alexander's routines, and resources to make certain kinds of problems disappear." Victoria's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee cup. "Parents? Mother is alive, living in Brooklyn under her maiden name. Carmen Morales, 24 years old, works at a pediatric clinic in Sunset Park. Clean background, no red flags, normal life until about 8 months ago, when she disappeared from her usual patterns for several weeks." Brennan opened the folder to reveal a photograph of a young woman with Sophia's dark eyes and delicate features. Carmen stood outside a brick building that looked like it belonged in the same neighborhood as Margaret's apartment, wearing scrubs and carrying a bag that suggested the particular exhaustion that came with caring for other people's children while earning barely enough to care for herself. "She thinks her daughter is being raised by a wealthy family who can provide everything she couldn't," Brennan continued. "Private schools, medical care, opportunities. She was told the adoption was handled through a specialized agency that works with high-profile clients who value privacy." "And the father?" Brennan's smile carried no warmth. "That's where things become interesting. According to the records I've been able to access, and some I probably shouldn't have, there is no father listed. But the agency that supposedly handled the adoption, it exists on paper only, created 18 months ago. Funded through a shell company that traces back to a trust that traces back to—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Victoria's mind was already calculating the implications, tracing the web of connections that led back to Alexander's private affairs. She had managed his charitable contributions, his tax-advantaged investments, his carefully structured philanthropic endeavors. Somewhere in that maze of legal documents and financial instruments was a thread that connected him to a 24-year-old clinic worker who believed she had given her daughter a better life. "How much does the mother know?" Victoria asked. "Nothing that would compromise your boss directly. She thinks she's dealing with legitimate intermediaries, people who specialize in connecting children with families who can provide what biological parents cannot. She receives updates, photographs, reports about her daughter's health and development, all very professional, very reassuring." Victoria absorbed this information with the practiced calm of someone who had spent decades insulating powerful people from the consequences of their complicated choices. But something about this situation felt different, more personal than the usual corporate entanglements that required her intervention. The cleaning woman, Margaret Santos. How does she fit into this? Brennan's expression darkened slightly. "She doesn't. She's exactly what she appears to be, someone who found an abandoned baby and fell in love. According to my research, she lost her own child 7 years ago, stillborn at a public hospital where the staff was overworked and the equipment was outdated. She's been working night shifts at your building ever since, sending money to family in El Salvador, living quietly, invisibly. The coffee shop hummed with conversations that had nothing to do with the careful destruction of lives that powerful people sometimes required. Victoria stared at the photograph of Carmen Morales, seeing in her young face the reflection of choices made by people who believed they were solving problems rather than creating them. "What are my options?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would depend on definitions of loyalty, protection, and the kind of damage control that kept empires intact. Brennan closed the folder, but left it within her reach. "You could tell Alexander what I've found. Let him decide how to handle the complications. You could arrange for the mother to learn the truth about where her daughter ended up, though that would create exposure." "Audrey," he paused, allowing the weight of implication to settle between them. "You could ensure that some information never surfaces, that certain connections remain invisible, that everyone continues believing what they need to believe to keep living their lives without disruption." Victoria picked up the folder, feeling its weight like a stone she might either use to build a foundation or throw through glass that would shatter everything. In 15 years of protecting Alexander from the consequences of power wielded without sufficient thought, she had never faced a situation where the collateral damage might include a baby who smiled at Mozart and a woman who cleaned offices to support dreams of family she thought she had lost forever. The choice she made in the next few minutes would determine whether love built on lies could survive the introduction of truth, or whether some secrets were too dangerous to disturb. Even when they imprisoned everyone they were meant to protect. Margaret's world had expanded by exactly 12 square feet, the dimensions of the playpen that had appeared in her living room 3 days ago, delivered by men in uniforms who treated the fourth-floor walk-up with the same professional courtesy they would have shown a penthouse. Sophia had claimed the space immediately, treating it as her personal kingdom where toys arranged themselves according to mysterious infant logic, and afternoon sunlight became a playground for tiny hands casting shadows on pale blue walls. The transformation of Margaret's apartment had been gradual enough to feel organic rather than imposed. A high chair that converted to a regular seat. A stroller that folded into geometric impossibility but somehow fit in her narrow hallway. A car seat that came with installation instructions written in 5 languages and the phone number of a service that would ensure it was positioned with the precision required to protect something infinitely precious. But it was the smaller changes that revealed the depth of what was happening between them all. The way Alexander had started arriving with dinner for 2 adults rather than just baby supplies. The way Margaret had begun setting out an extra coffee cup before he knocked. The way Sophia had started crying when it was time for him to leave, as if she understood that their small circle was incomplete when reduced to just 2. On this Thursday evening, Margaret was attempting to feed Sophia while reviewing paperwork from Child Services, forms that would formalize what had begun as emergency care and evolve into something permanent. The legal language was dense, intimidating in its implications, but each signature brought her closer to a future where love could be backed by law rather than existing in the uncertain space between bureaucratic gaps. Sophia was being particularly contrary about eating, preferring to paint her face with pureed carrots rather than actually consume them, when Alexander's knock came at the door. Margaret opened it to find him carrying Chinese takeout and wearing an expression that combined exhaustion with something resembling relief. "Long day?" she asked, stepping aside to let him enter the domestic chaos that Sophia had created with the efficiency of a very small tornado. "Board meeting," he replied, setting the food on her kitchen counter with movements that had become familiar. 6 hours of grown men arguing about market projections while the real world happened somewhere else entirely. He moved to Sophia's high chair, where she immediately launched into an animated monologue of babbling, that might have been commentary on global economics, or simply delight at seeing someone who understood the importance of her opinions. Alexander responded with the serious attention he usually reserved for quarterly reports, nodding at appropriate intervals as if her observations about pureed vegetables carried the weight of policy recommendations. Margaret watched this exchange while transferring lo mein into bowls that had never held anything more exotic than rice and beans. The sight of Alexander Whitmore, featured on the covers of business magazines, quoted in newspapers that shaped national conversations, engaged in earnest dialogue with a baby covered in orange food, struck her as simultaneously absurd and deeply right. "She's been fussy today," Margaret said, settling at the small table where they had begun sharing meals with the frequency of people who had discovered they preferred each other's company to solitude. "The social worker says it's normal, that babies sense changes in routine, stress from the adults around them." Alexander paused in his conversation with Sophia, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "Changes." Margaret gestured toward the stack of papers beside her plate. "The adoption paperwork. If everything goes smoothly, I should have permanent custody within 8 weeks. Jennifer says it's unusual for the process to move this quickly, but Sophia's case is being expedited because there's no family coming forward to contest the placement." The silence that followed was filled only by Sophia's continued commentary and the distant sound of sirens navigating city streets. Alexander stared at his food without eating, his mind clearly working through implications that Margaret couldn't see but could feel in the way tension gathered around him like a storm front. 8 weeks, he repeated. "Maybe sooner, if the background checks come back clean. Jennifer says I'm exactly the kind of placement they hope for. Stable employment, suitable housing, clear motivation." Margaret's voice carried pride, mixed with lingering disbelief that her life could accommodate such happiness. "Of course, there's always the possibility that someone will come forward. Birth parents have rights, even when they've made choices that seem final." Alexander's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Margaret caught something in his expression, a flicker of knowledge or concern that disappeared too quickly to interpret. She had learned to read his moods over the past month, understanding when his silence meant concentration and when it meant he was editing his thoughts before speaking. "Have you thought about what you'll do if that happens?" he asked carefully. Margaret looked at Sophia, who had abandoned her attempts at eating in favor of trying to grab Alexander's tie, which had somehow become the most fascinating object in her universe. "Every day. Every time she smiles, every time she reaches for me when she's scared, every time she falls asleep in my arms, I think about what it would mean to lose her, and I think about what it would mean to keep her from someone who might love her just as much. And I hope that whoever made the choice to leave her with strangers had good reasons. I hope they wanted what was best for her more than what was easy for them. Because if they did, then maybe they'll understand that she's not just surviving here, she's thriving. She's loved." Alexander reached out to disentangle his tie from Sophia's grip, but she held on with the determination that had become her trademark approach to anything worth having. Instead of pulling away, he leaned closer, allowing her to examine the silk fabric with the scientific thoroughness she applied to all new discoveries. "Love isn't always enough," he said quietly. Margaret studied his profile, noting the way his jaw tightened, as if he were fighting some internal battle. "No," she agreed, "but it's a start. And sometimes, when people are brave enough to choose what's right over what's easy, love becomes enough to build everything else on." Sophia released the tie and clapped her hands together, delighted with her own accomplishment. The sound was pure joy, untainted by the complexities that surrounded her existence. In that moment, sitting around a table too small for the life that was growing within its boundaries, all three of them seemed to understand that the choices ahead would require more courage than any of them had been asked to summon before. But for now, with Chinese food growing cold and a baby practicing her applause, it was enough to sit in the presence of something worth protecting, even when protection meant accepting that love sometimes required letting go. Carmen Morales finished her shift at the Sunset Park Pediatric Clinic with the same mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that had marked her days for the past 18 months. Working with children had become both sanctuary and torment. Every baby she weighed, every toddler she comforted, every mother she reassured carried echoes of the choice she had made 8 months ago when her own world had narrowed to impossible options. The walk to her apartment took 23 minutes through streets that had become familiar in their rhythms of struggle and survival. Brooklyn in the evening was a symphony of languages and cooking smells. Children playing between parked cars while their parents watched from fire escapes, the kind of community that formed when people understood that looking out for each other wasn't charity but necessity. Her building was identical to dozens of others on the block. Red brick, narrow windows, front steps worn smooth by generations of feet that had climbed toward dreams that were modest but fiercely defended. Carmen's apartment on the 3rd floor was small but carefully maintained, filled with furniture that served multiple purposes and photographs that chronicled a life lived close to the bone, but rich in connections that mattered. She had just settled at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and the kind of budget calculations that required optimistic math when the knock came at her door. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in an expensive suit whose silver hair and confident posture suggested someone accustomed to getting what she wanted through a combination of authority and charm. "Miss Morales." The woman's voice carried professional warmth. "My name is Victoria Kane." The updates came monthly through official channels, photographs of a beautiful baby growing healthy and strong, reports of developmental milestones reached on schedule, reassurances that her sacrifice had purchased exactly the kind of life she had dreamed of but couldn't deliver. She opened the door slowly, studying Victoria's face for clues about whether this unexpected visit carried good news or the kind of complications that could unravel carefully constructed peace. "Is something wrong?" Carmen asked, stepping aside to let Victoria enter an apartment that suddenly felt too small, too humble, too revealing of exactly why she had made the choices that still woke her up at night. Victoria moved through the space with eyes that catalogued details without judgment, professional assessment disguised as polite interest. "I'm here about your daughter." Carmen's hand froze on the deadbolt, her heart performing the irregular rhythm that had become familiar whenever anyone mentioned the child she had given up to secure a future she couldn't provide. She settled on the couch that had been Carmen's first major purchase after high school, worn but clean, functional rather than beautiful. "Nothing's wrong with Sophia," Victoria said, using the name that Carmen had whispered during 9 months of pregnancy. The name that had somehow found its way into official documents, despite her assumption that adoptive parents would choose something that better reflected their own heritage and hopes. "She's healthy, happy, developing exactly as she should be." Carmen felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but Victoria's presence still carried implications that made her nervous. "Then why?" "There have been some changes in her placement situation. Nothing that affects her well-being, but the family that was originally chosen to raise her has encountered some complications. We're exploring alternative arrangements that might better serve Sophia's long-term interests." The words were carefully chosen, professional in their vagueness, but Carmen had worked in enough institutional settings to recognize the language of bureaucracy, attempting to deliver unwelcome news gently. She sat across from Victoria, her hands folded in her lap with the composure of someone who had learned early that showing emotion to official people rarely improved outcomes. "What kind of complications?" Victoria opened her briefcase and removed a folder that she held without opening, as if its contents required careful introduction. The adoption was arranged through channels that, upon further review, may not have followed all the protocols required for such placements. There are questions about documentation, consent procedures, the verification of the adoptive family's suitability. Carmen's world tilted slightly, the careful structure of acceptance she had built around her decision suddenly feeling less stable. "Are you saying something was wrong with the adoption?" "I'm saying that sometimes, even with the best intentions, the systems designed to protect children and families can develop irregularities that require correction. The important thing is that Sophia is safe and well cared for while we sort out the proper legal framework for her future." The silence that followed was filled with the kind of questions that had no easy answers. Carmen stared at the folder in Victoria's lap, understanding that it contained information that could reshape everything she thought she knew about the choice that had defined the past 8 months of her life. "Where is she now?" Carmen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's being cared for by someone who loves her very much, someone who wants nothing more than to ensure her happiness and security. But the legal complexities of the situation mean that we need to consider all options, including the possibility that you might want to reconsider your original decision." Carmen's breath caught in her throat. The idea that she might see her daughter again, might hold her, might have the chance to be the mother she had wanted to be but couldn't afford to become, struck her like lightning, illuminating and terrifying in equal measure. "I gave up my rights," she said, testing the words against this new reality. "I signed papers." Victoria's expression softened slightly, revealing something almost maternal beneath the professional competence. "You made a decision based on information that may not have been complete. You wanted what was best for your daughter, and that desire hasn't changed. What has changed is the circumstances surrounding how that desire was implemented." Carmen stood and moved to the window, looking down at the street where children played games that had been passed down through generations of urban survivors. She thought about Sophia, a name she had chosen because it meant wisdom, hoping her daughter would be smarter than her mother about navigating a world that offered few second chances to women who started with nothing. If I wanted to see her, would that be possible?" Victoria's answer carried the weight of decisions that would reshape multiple lives. "That would depend on several factors, including what you want that meeting to accomplish and whether you're prepared for the possibility that seeing her might change everything you thought you had accepted about your future." The folder remained closed, its contents a mystery that might contain either salvation or destruction. Carmen understood that opening it would mean stepping through a door that couldn't be closed again, entering a territory where love and loss intersected in ways that required more courage than she had needed to summon since the day she had signed away her right to call herself Sophia's mother. But as the evening light faded over Brooklyn, illuminating the lives of families who had found ways to survive despite circumstances that should have broken them, Carmen found herself reaching for the folder, ready to learn whether some mistakes could be corrected and whether second chances were possible for women brave enough to fight for them. The photograph slipped from Carmen's fingers like a prayer answered and a nightmare realized simultaneously. Sophia's face looked back at her from glossy paper, 9 months older than the last image Carmen had treasured, but unmistakably the daughter who had lived inside her body for 9 months before being born into a world that offered love without resources or resources without love, but rarely both together. But it wasn't the baby's growth that stopped Carmen's breath. It was the arms holding her. Margaret Santos smiled at the camera with the unconscious joy of someone who had found her purpose accidentally and embraced it completely. Her face, lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from night shifts and early mornings, radiated the particular contentment that belonged to mothers who had discovered that love could grow stronger in soil fertilized by sacrifice. "This is Sophia's current caregiver," Victoria said, watching Carmen's reaction with the attention of someone conducting a psychological experiment. Margaret Santos. She found Sophia under difficult circumstances and has been providing temporary care while the legal issues surrounding the adoption are resolved. Carmen traced her daughter's face with trembling fingers, noting changes that marked time she had missed. The way Sophia's eyes had developed focus and intention, how her small hands had learned to grasp objects with purpose rather than reflex. The expression of alert curiosity that suggested a mind already beginning to catalogue the world around her. "She looks happy," Carmen whispered, and the admission cost her something she couldn't name. "She is happy. Margaret has provided excellent care, love, stability. But the situation is temporary by necessity. The legal complexities of Sophia's placement mean that permanent decisions need to be made soon, decisions that will determine her future in ways that can't be undone." Victoria produced a second photograph, this one showing Sophia in the arms of a man whose expensive suit looked incongruous against the backdrop of what appeared to be a modest apartment. Alexander Whitmore held the baby with careful reverence, his face displaying an expression Carmen had never seen in the business magazines where his image occasionally appeared. Vulnerability mixed with protective tenderness. And this man? Alexander Whitmore. A complicated factor in Sophia's current situation. He's developed an attachment to her, has been providing financial support for her care. His interest in the case is personal rather than professional. Carmen studied the photograph, noting how Sophia's body relaxed completely in Alexander's arms, how his attention focused entirely on her as if she were the most important person in his universe. The intimacy captured in the image spoke of time spent together, of bonds formed through the daily rhythms of care and attention that couldn't be faked for cameras. "Are they?" Carmen began, then stopped, unsure how to frame questions about relationships that defied conventional categories. They're three people who have found each other in circumstances that none of them expected. Margaret loves Sophia with the fierce protectiveness of someone who has experienced loss and won't accept it again. Alexander loves her with the bewilderment of someone discovering that wealth can't buy the things that matter most. And Sophia... Victoria paused, allowing the weight of observation to settle between them. Sophia responds to both of them as if they were family. Carmen set the photographs aside, her hands shaking with emotions that had no names because they lived in the space between grief and hope. "What are you asking me to do?" Victoria's answer came with the precision of someone who had anticipated every possible question. "I'm asking you to consider whether the choice you made 8 months ago was based on complete information. You believed you were placing Sophia with a wealthy family who could provide opportunities you couldn't. Instead, she's being raised by a woman who cleans offices for minimum wage, and a man whose involvement raises questions about propriety and permanence. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for months without anyone noticing." Carmen understood that Victoria was offering her something that went beyond second chances, the opportunity to reclaim a decision that had been based on assumptions about what constituted the best possible future for a child born into circumstances that offered no easy answers. "If I wanted her back," Carmen said, testing the words against their consequences, "what would that mean for them? For Margaret? For this man who's obviously attached to her?" Victoria's expression remained neutral, but something behind her eyes suggested calculations that had nothing to do with Sophia's welfare, and everything to do with protecting interests that Carmen couldn't see. It would mean that 3 adults would need to navigate a situation where everyone's love for Sophia is genuine, but not everyone's claim to her is equally valid under law. You're her biological mother. That carries weight that emotional attachment, however sincere, can't override. Carmen stood and walked to her kitchen window, looking down at the courtyard where children played with the unconscious confidence of those who had never doubted their place in their families. She thought about the choice she had made in a hospital room where the walls seemed to press inward with the weight of impossible decisions, signing papers that promised her daughter a future that Carmen's love alone couldn't guarantee. "I was 19 when I got pregnant," she said, speaking to her reflection in the glass. "Working 2 jobs, no family support, no insurance. The counselors at the agency showed me pictures of couples who wanted children, families who could provide education, healthcare, stability. They made it sound like keeping her would be selfish, like denying her opportunities because I wasn't ready to be the mother she deserved. And now?" Carmen turned back to Victoria, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from recognizing truth that had been waiting patiently for acknowledgement. "Now I'm 24. I have a steady job, health insurance, a home. I'm not the scared teenager who thought love wasn't enough, but I'm also not naive enough to believe that wanting something makes it right." Victoria leaned forward slightly, sensing the moment when possibility became intention. "What do you want to happen?" Carmen picked up the photographs again, studying the faces of 3 people whose lives had intersected around her daughter in ways that suggested destiny rather than coincidence. She saw love in all their expressions, but also uncertainty, the recognition that happiness built on unstable foundations could collapse under the weight of truth finally acknowledged. "I want to meet them," Carmen said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had learned that courage meant moving forward despite fear, rather than waiting for fear to disappear. "I want to see my daughter. And I want to understand how we can all do what's best for her, even if that means accepting that what's best might not be what any of us originally wanted." Victoria closed her briefcase, with movements that suggested plans falling into place with mechanical precision. "That can be arranged, but you should understand that once you open this door, everything changes. For everyone." Carmen nodded, understanding that some doors could only be walked through once, that some choices remade the world in ways that couldn't be undone. But as she looked at photographs of her daughter surrounded by people who loved her, she realized that some risks were worth taking if they offered the possibility of building something real from the fragments of dreams that had been broken by circumstance and fear. The evening light faded over Brooklyn, illuminating windows behind which families navigated the complex choreography of love and obligation. And in one small apartment, a young woman prepared to reclaim her right to fight for a future that might include the daughter she had given away and the strangers who had given her daughter a home worth fighting for. The knock came at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had begun like any other, but would end by reshaping the definition of family for everyone involved. Margaret was feeding Sophia mashed bananas, a process that involved more food on the baby's face than in her mouth, when the sound interrupted their routine with the weight of inevitability. Through the peephole, Margaret saw Jennifer from Child Services flanked by 2 people she didn't recognize, a young Latina woman whose nervous energy radiated even through the distorted glass, and an older woman in an expensive suit whose presence suggested complications that social workers usually tried to avoid. Margaret's hands trembled as she unlocked the door. Sophia balanced on her hip with the unconscious ease of someone who had learned to navigate the world one-handed. The baby sensed tension immediately, her usual cheerful babbling replaced by the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood more than anyone credited her with. "Mrs. Santos," Jennifer said, her professional warmth unable to completely mask the discomfort of her mission. "I'd like you to meet Carmen Morales. She's—" The pause stretched long enough to contain universes of legal complexity and emotional devastation. "She's Sophia's biological mother." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, even though some part of her had been expecting this moment since the night she found Sophia in Alexander's office. She looked at Carmen, young, beautiful, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to be strong by necessity, and saw her own future dissolving like sugar in rain. Carmen's eyes went immediately to Sophia, her breath catching audibly as she took in the reality of her daughter 9 months later. The baby stared back with the frank curiosity she applied to all new faces, showing no recognition, but no fear either. For a moment that felt eternal, mother and daughter studied each other across a gulf of missed time and impossible choices. "May we come in?" Jennifer asked gently. Margaret stepped aside because refusing would have been pointless. This conversation was going to happen whether she participated willingly or not. Her apartment, which had felt like a sanctuary for 2 months, suddenly seemed too small to contain the emotions that filled it like smoke from a fire no one knew how to extinguish. They arranged themselves in her living room with the awkward formality of people attending a funeral where no one was quite sure who had died. Carmen sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. Victoria Kane positioned herself near the window, observing rather than participating, her presence suggesting interests that went beyond Sophia's immediate welfare. "Carmen has some concerns about the circumstances of Sophia's adoption," Jennifer began, using the careful language of bureaucracy to discuss matters of the heart. "There appear to have been irregularities in the process, questions about whether the original placement followed proper procedures." Margaret felt the world shifting beneath her feet, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "What kind of irregularities?" Carmen leaned forward, her words emerging with the urgency of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for weeks. "I was told Sophia was being placed with a wealthy family, people who could give her opportunities I couldn't provide. Private schools, the best medical care, a stable home with 2 parents who'd been waiting years for a child." She gestured toward the modest apartment that had become Sophia's world, the playpen constructed from donated supplies, toys that were clean but second-hand, furniture that served its purpose without pretension. "Instead, she's being raised by someone who—" Carmen stopped, recognizing the cruelty of what she was about to say. "Someone like me," Margaret finished quietly. "Someone who cleans other people's offices to pay rent, who shops for groceries with coupons, who can't afford the kind of future that money buys." The silence that followed was filled with Sophia's contented gurgling as she played with Margaret's hair, oblivious to the adult complexities that were determining her fate. Her happiness in Margaret's arms was evident, undeniable, but it couldn't erase the legal realities that gave biological parents rights that emotional attachment couldn't override. "I never said I didn't want her," Carmen continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I said I couldn't provide for her the way she deserved. I thought I was being selfless, giving her a better life. If I had known she would end up in a situation identical to mine—" "But she didn't," Margaret interrupted, surprising everyone, including herself, with the firmness in her voice. "She ended up with someone who loves her enough to work 16-hour days to make sure she has everything she needs. She ended up with someone who sits by her crib when she's sick, who plays Mozart because it makes her smile, who would rather go without meals than let her want for anything." Carmen's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back since seeing Sophia again. "I love her too. I've loved her every day since I gave birth to her, loved her enough to sign papers that broke my heart because I thought it would give her a better life." Victoria Kane chose this moment to speak, her voice cutting through the emotional chaos with clinical precision. "The legal reality is that Carmen never formally relinquished her parental rights. The adoption agency that supposedly processed the placement appears to have been operating without proper authorization. From a legal standpoint, Sophia was never formally adopted by anyone." The implications crashed over Margaret like a wave that left her gasping. All the paperwork she had filed, all the background checks and home visits, all the careful construction of legal guardianship, none of it meant anything if the original transfer of custody had been fraudulent. "So what happens now?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer would reshape everything she had built her future around. Jennifer's response carried the weight of bureaucratic machinery that ground forward regardless of the human hearts it crushed in the process. Carmen has the right to reclaim custody of her daughter immediately. The temporary placement you've been providing was based on the assumption that no family was available to care for Sophia. That assumption has proven incorrect. Sophia chose that moment to reach for Carmen, her small hand extending with the same unconscious trust she had shown Margaret and Alexander. Carmen's breath caught as tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb, and for the first time since entering the apartment, she smiled through her tears. "She's beautiful," Carmen whispered. "You've taken such good care of her." Margaret watched her daughter, because Sophia had become her daughter in every way that mattered, respond to her biological mother with openness and curiosity. The sight should have been heartbreaking, but instead it filled Margaret with a pride that transcended possession. She had loved Sophia well enough that the baby could trust new people, could extend affection without fear, could embody the security that came from being valued unconditionally. "What do you want?" Margaret asked Carmen directly, bypassing the bureaucrats, who would reduce this moment to procedures and protocols. Carmen's answer came with the honesty of someone who had learned that truth, however painful, was the only foundation on which real choices could be built. "I want to be her mother. I want the chance to give her everything I couldn't provide before, but I also want to understand what giving her that chance might cost her and cost you." Margaret looked down at Sophia, who was now reaching for both women simultaneously, her small hands creating bridges across an impossible divide. In the baby's gesture, Margaret glimpsed the possibility that love didn't have to be a zero-sum game, that families could be built through choice rather than biology, that maybe the question wasn't who deserved Sophia, but who Sophia deserved to have in her life. But as evening shadows lengthened across her apartment, Margaret also understood that some choices couldn't be postponed indefinitely, and that tomorrow would require decisions that would determine whether love could survive the introduction of justice, or whether justice would demand sacrifices that love couldn't bear to make. Alexander arrived at Margaret's apartment building to find a black sedan identical to his own parked at the curb, its presence suggesting that whatever crisis had summoned him through Margaret's panicked phone call had attracted other interested parties. He climbed 4 flights of stairs with the urgency of someone who understood that some emergencies couldn't be solved with money or influence, that some problems required presence rather than resources. The door opened before he could knock, revealing Margaret with Sophia in her arms and an expression that combined devastation with fierce protectiveness. Behind her, he could see people in her small living room, strangers, whose very presence suggested that the careful world they had built together was collapsing with the efficiency of controlled demolition. "She's here," Margaret said without preamble. "Sophia's mother. She wants her back." The words hit Alexander like physical blows, each syllable carrying implications that his mind immediately began calculating and rejecting in equal measure. He entered the apartment, moving through conversations that stopped at his appearance, aware that his presence changed the dynamic in ways that had nothing to do with his intentions. Carmen Morales sat on Margaret's couch holding Sophia with the careful reverence of someone reuniting with something precious that had been thought lost forever. The baby responded to her with curious attention, showing no distress but also no special recognition, a fact that seemed to both comfort and wound the young woman in ways that Alexander recognized despite never having experienced them himself. Victoria Kane stood near the window, her expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting someone whose carefully laid plans were proceeding exactly as intended. When their eyes met, Alexander felt the first stirring of suspicion that this crisis had been orchestrated rather than discovered. "Mr. Whitmore," Jennifer from Child Services said, her professional composure slightly strained by the addition of another powerful figure to an already complex situation. "I wasn't aware you were involved in Sophia's care." I'm involved in her life, Alexander replied, his voice carrying the weight of decisions made in corporate boardrooms where precision mattered more than diplomacy, which makes me involved in anything that affects her welfare. He moved to where Margaret stood, positioning himself slightly in front of her in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Sophia saw him and immediately began the excited babbling that had become her signature greeting, reaching out with both hands in the universal infant demand for attention. Carmen's reaction to Alexander's presence was immediate and complex: surprise, recognition from photographs she had been shown, and something approaching fear as she calculated what his involvement might mean for her ability to reclaim her daughter. "This is Sophia's biological mother, Carmen Morales," Victoria said, her voice carrying undertones that Alexander was beginning to recognize as manipulation, disguised as information. "She's discovered some irregularities in the adoption process and has concerns about Sophia's current placement." Alexander studied Carmen with the attention he usually reserved for reading quarterly reports, noting details that painted a picture of someone who had made difficult choices and was now questioning whether those choices had been based on accurate information. She was young, but carried herself with the dignity of someone who had learned to navigate institutional systems designed to help people like her in theory while failing them in practice. "What kind of irregularities?" he asked, though something in Victoria's expression suggested he might not want to hear the answer. Carmen shifted Sophia to her other arm, the movement natural enough to suggest muscle memory that transcended the 9 months of separation. "I was told Sophia was being placed with a wealthy family through a legitimate adoption agency. Instead, she ended up with—" She gestured toward Margaret's modest apartment, unable to finish the sentence without acknowledging the love that was evident in every detail. "With someone who found her abandoned and chose to love her," Alexander said, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone in the room understand that his involvement went beyond casual philanthropy. "That's exactly the problem," Victoria interjected smoothly. "The circumstances of Sophia's abandonment raised questions about whether proper procedures were followed. Carmen has legitimate concerns about why her daughter ended up in an emergency placement rather than the permanent family situation she was promised." Alexander's mind began working through the implications with the systematic efficiency that had built his fortune. Someone had taken Carmen's baby under false pretenses, created fraudulent documentation, and arranged for Sophia to be found in his office by someone whose personal history guaranteed she would fall in love immediately. The sophistication required for such manipulation suggested resources and access that narrowed the list of possible perpetrators considerably. "Where exactly was Sophia supposed to be placed?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. Carmen reached into her purse and withdrew a folder that Victoria watched with slightly more attention than the gesture warranted. "The Whitmore Foundation." Carmen read from documents that appeared official, but felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. Alexander stared at the documents that bore his name, his foundation's letterhead, and his signature, forged with enough skill to fool anyone who didn't know that he had never authorized such services and had certainly never approved the creation of fictitious adoption agencies. "I've never seen these papers before in my life," Alexander said, his voice carrying the cold fury of someone discovering the extent to which his identity had been borrowed for purposes he would never have. "Approved." Victoria's expression remained neutral, but something behind her eyes suggested calculations being rapidly revised. "A private family placement service affiliated with the Whitmore Trust." The silence that followed was so complete that Sophia's contented gurgling seemed loud enough to wake neighbors. "Perhaps there's been some confusion about the Foundation's activities." "There's been no confusion," Alexander interrupted, his attention now focused entirely on his assistant with the intensity he usually reserved for corporate adversaries. "There's been fraud." Systematic, sophisticated fraud that used my name and resources to manipulate a young woman into giving up her child under false pretenses. Carmen looked between them, understanding finally beginning to dawn that she had been a victim of something far more complex than bureaucratic incompetence. Are you saying that the agency that promised my daughter a better life never existed? Alexander finished. Someone created a fictional organization, forged documents, and convinced you that giving up Sophia would guarantee her opportunities that were never going to be provided. Someone wanted your daughter for reasons that had nothing to do with her welfare and everything to do with... He stopped, the full scope of the manipulation finally becoming clear. Someone had counted on his own response to finding a baby in his office, predicting that he would become involved in ways that went beyond simple charity. The question wasn't who had abandoned Sophia. It was who had engineered circumstances to ensure that specific people would fall in love with her, creating emotional bonds that could be leveraged for purposes that had nothing to do with the baby's best interests. As he looked around the room at the faces of people whose lives had been shaped by someone else's agenda, Alexander realized that unraveling this conspiracy would require more than exposing fraud. It would require making choices about what kind of family they wanted to be for Sophia, and whether love that had been manipulated into existence could survive the discovery of its artificial origins. But first, he needed to understand exactly who had been pulling strings from the beginning, and why someone with the resources to orchestrate such elaborate deception had chosen to target a cleaning woman, a businessman, and a young mother whose only crime had been believing that sacrifice could guarantee her daughter's happiness. Victoria Kane had built her career on understanding that powerful men were most vulnerable when they believed they were acting from strength. Someone had orchestrated Sophia's abandonment to ensure she would be found by Margaret, knowing that a woman who had lost her own child would never be able to resist caring for another. For 15 years, she had protected Alexander from scandals that would have destroyed lesser executives, managed crises that could have toppled empires, and made decisions that preserved his reputation at costs he had never been asked to calculate. But as she watched him piece together the scope of her manipulation, she realized that some protections came with prices that eventually demanded payment. "We need to discuss this privately," Victoria said, her voice maintaining professional calm despite the recognition that her carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse with increasing momentum. Alexander's response carried the Arctic coldness that had made him legendary in negotiations where billions hung on the ability to remain unmoved by emotional appeals. "We'll discuss it here, in front of everyone whose lives you've manipulated, starting with why you created a fictional adoption agency using my foundation's name." Carmen held Sophia closer, the baby sensing tension but responding to it with the trust of someone who had learned that the adults in her world would protect her from dangers she couldn't understand. Margaret moved to stand beside Carmen, their shared love for Sophia overriding the territorial instincts that should have made them rivals. Victoria glanced toward the door, calculating distances and escape routes with the efficiency of someone who had planned for various contingencies. But Alexander's presence blocked the most direct exit, and something in his posture suggested that leaving would only delay rather than prevent the conversation that would determine how many lives would be destroyed by revelations that should have remained buried. "I was protecting you," Victoria said finally, choosing words that carried decades of justification for decisions that had seemed necessary at the time. 8 months ago, you were drinking yourself toward a breakdown, isolated, making choices that would have eventually attracted attention from people who wouldn't have been as discreet as I've been." Alexander's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes suggested he was remembering patterns of behavior that had seemed self-destructive but might have been symptomatic of something deeper. Continue. You needed connection, purpose, something to remind you that power without human attachment eventually becomes meaningless. But your history with relationships suggested that conventional approaches wouldn't work. You trust people with resources rather than need, and that trust usually proves misplaced. Victoria moved closer to the window, positioning herself where afternoon light would make her expression harder to read. I researched options, scenarios that might create genuine bonds without the complications that usually accompany your involvement with people who want something from you. So, you decided to manufacture a crisis, Alexander said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that preceded decisions capable of reshaping industries. You found a young mother in impossible circumstances and convinced her that giving up her child would guarantee opportunities that were never going to exist. Carmen's breathing became shallow as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. You planned this, all of it, my pregnancy, my decision to give her up, everything that happened afterward. Not your pregnancy, Victoria corrected, as if the distinction mattered in the face of what she had orchestrated. But once I learned about your situation through contacts at the clinic where you received prenatal care, I recognized an opportunity to solve multiple problems simultaneously. Margaret found her voice, though it emerged rough with emotions that had no adequate words. You destroyed her family to create ours. Victoria's response revealed the cold calculation that had guided 15 years of protecting Alexander from consequences that other people absorbed on his behalf. I created circumstances where 3 people could build something meaningful together. Carmen was going to lose her daughter anyway. She couldn't provide adequate care, had no family support, no resources. At least this way, Sophia ended up with people who could love her properly. By lying to everyone involved, Alexander said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape everything Victoria had spent years constructing. By manipulating documents, creating false agencies, forging signatures that could send you to federal prison for fraud that spans multiple jurisdictions. Sophia began to fuss, responding to the adult tension that filled the room like smoke from a fire no one knew how to extinguish. Carmen rocked her gently, the motion natural enough to suggest muscle memory that transcended the months of separation. "What were you planning to do next?" Alexander asked, his question carrying implications that made everyone in the room understand that Victoria's manipulations extended beyond what had already been revealed. Victoria's silence stretched long enough to encompass years of decisions made in service of protection that had become indistinguishable from control. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone acknowledging that some games could only end one way. Carmen was going to discover irregularities in the adoption process and demand her daughter back. You would have fought to protect Margaret and Sophia, using resources that would have guaranteed Carmen couldn't afford legal representation. Eventually, you would have won custody through financial attrition, Margaret would have remained in Sophia's life as a caregiver, and Carmen would have accepted financial compensation that allowed her to build a life without the burden of single motherhood she wasn't equipped to handle. The room fell silent, except for Sophia's soft breathing as she settled against Carmen's shoulder, trusting in the way that only children could when surrounded by adults whose love for her was the only constant in a world of shifting allegiances and hidden agendas. Alexander studied Victoria with the attention he usually reserved for contracts that contained clauses designed to transfer risk without acknowledging it explicitly. And you would have managed the entire arrangement, ensuring that everyone remained grateful for opportunities they didn't realize you had manufactured. I would have ensured that Sophia grew up in a stable environment with people who loved her, that Carmen was compensated for her sacrifice, that Margaret found the family she lost, and that you discovered what it meant to build something meaningful rather than simply acquiring resources. Carmen's voice emerged as barely a whisper, but it carried enough force to cut through Victoria's rationalizations like a blade through tissue paper. You would have stolen my daughter and convinced me to be grateful for the theft." Victoria's response revealed the moral blindness that had allowed her to justify 15 years of managing Alexander's life without acknowledging the cost to people whose existence she had reduced to variables in equations designed to optimize outcomes for the one person whose welfare she had prioritized above all others. "I would have given your daughter the life you wanted her to have, but couldn't provide." Sometimes love requires accepting that sacrifice serves greater purposes than possession. The silence that followed was broken only by Sophia's contented gurgling as she played with Carmen's hair, oblivious to the adult complexities that were determining whether the people who loved her would be able to remain in her life or whether truth would destroy the family that manipulation had created. Alexander looked around the room at the faces of people whose lives had been shaped by Victoria's agenda, understanding finally that some betrayals cut deep enough to sever bonds that had seemed unbreakable. But he also understood that Sophia's future couldn't be built on foundations that required lies to remain stable, that whatever family emerged from this crisis would need to be constructed from truth rather than convenience. The choice he made in the next few minutes would determine not only Victoria's fate, but whether three adults who had learned to love each other through loving the same child could find ways to build something real from the wreckage of someone else's attempt to engineer happiness through systematic deception. 6 weeks later, the coffee shop in Brooklyn had become their neutral ground, a space where three adults could navigate the complex choreography of shared custody, while Sophia practiced her newfound skill of grabbing everything within reach and examining it with the scientific thoroughness that had become her signature approach to understanding the world. Margaret arrived first, as had become their routine, claiming the corner table that offered enough space for a high chair and the various supplies that accompanied Sophia's public appearances. She spread toys across the surface with the efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate a 9-month-old's attention span, then checked her phone for messages from Carmen, who was coming directly from her shift at the clinic. The arrangement they had negotiated wasn't perfect, but it was real in ways that the fabricated solutions Victoria had engineered could never have been. Sophia spent weekdays with Carmen in Brooklyn, weekends with Margaret in Manhattan, and evenings when both women's schedules allowed in spaces like this one, where they could observe each other's parenting styles and slowly build trust through the accumulated evidence of shared love. Alexander's role had evolved into something that defied conventional categories, but somehow felt right to everyone involved. He wasn't Sophia's father in any legal sense, but he was the man who appeared at emergency room visits, who had established the college fund that would guarantee Sophia's education regardless of what the future held, who showed up at coffee shop meetings with toys that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the patience to sit on floors that weren't designed for expensive suits. Carmen entered carrying Sophia with the confidence of someone who had relearned the weight and rhythm of her daughter over weeks of careful reintroduction. The baby's face lit up at seeing Margaret, her arms extending with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a favorite person, rather than a stranger who had temporarily disrupted her routine. She learned a new sound, Carmen announced, settling Sophia into the high chair that Alexander had bought after researching safety ratings with the thoroughness he usually applied to merger acquisitions. Margaret and Carmen responded with the kind of delighted attention that all babies craved, their shared focus on Sophia's development, creating bridges across differences that had once seemed insurmountable. Alexander arrived carrying legal documents that had become a regular feature of their meetings, papers that formalized custody arrangements, established guardianship protocols, and created the bureaucratic framework that allowed love to function within systems designed for traditional family structures. "She's been practicing it all morning," Sophia demonstrated immediately, producing a string of consonants that might have been an attempt at language or simply the joy of discovering what her mouth could do when she applied systematic effort. Victoria's fraud had been exposed, investigated and prosecuted, but cleaning up the legal mess she had created required ongoing attention from lawyers who specialized in cases where emotional attachment intersected with regulatory requirements. The judge approved the modified arrangement, Alexander said, settling into his chair with movements that had become more relaxed over the weeks of shared custody experiments. Carmen retains primary legal custody. Margaret maintains weekend placement with full guardian rights, and I'm listed as an interested party with financial responsibility for Sophia's ongoing needs. Carmen looked up from wiping Sophia's face, which had become decorated with pieces of banana during the conversation. What does that mean practically? It means that if anything happens to any of us, Sophia's care continues without disruption. It means that medical decisions require consultation among all parties, but can be made by whoever is physically present in emergencies. It means that we've created something that doesn't exist in family law, but functions anyway, because we all want the same thing. Margaret watched Sophia attempt to feed herself with the determination of someone tackling a complex engineering problem, noting improvements in coordination that marked the passage of time in ways that adults rarely acknowledged. And Victoria? Alexander's expression darkened slightly, but his voice remained level when he spoke about his former assistant. Federal charges for fraud, forgery and wire crime. She'll probably serve 18 months, maybe 2 years. Her lawyers are arguing for diminished sentence based on claims that she believed she was acting in everyone's best interests. Do you believe that? Carmen asked, genuine curiosity rather than judgment coloring her question. Alexander considered the question with the care it deserved, thinking about 15 years of working with someone who had managed his professional life with increasing control over time. I believe she convinced herself that controlling other people's choices was the same as protecting them from making mistakes. I believe she lost the ability to distinguish between helping and manipulating. But I also believe that what she did to you, to Sophia, was unforgivable regardless of her motivations. Sophia chose that moment to successfully grab Margaret's coffee cup, nearly overturning it before 3 pairs of adult hands intervened simultaneously. The baby's delighted laughter at the commotion she had created filled the space with the kind of joy that existed independent of adult complexities, reminding everyone present that some things mattered more than legal arrangements or past betrayals. "She's getting stronger," Margaret observed, straightening the table while Sophia returned her attention to the engineering challenge of self-feeding. "And more determined," Carmen smiled, recognizing traits that had been present even before birth, the single-minded focus that had announced itself through kicks that followed no discernible pattern except persistence. "She gets that from both sides of her family." The phrase hung in the air between them, acknowledging something that had evolved gradually over weeks of shared custody experiments. They were becoming a family, not the kind that appeared in textbooks or legal precedents, but the kind that formed when people chose each other deliberately and worked to build something that served everyone's needs rather than conforming to existing models. Alexander pulled out his phone to show them photographs from Sophia's first professional photo session, images that would be used for the holiday cards he was sending to business associates who were still trying to understand how a man known for ruthless efficiency had become devoted to someone else's abandoned baby. "I thought we might want copies for everyone." The photographs captured Sophia at 9 months, sitting confidently without support, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and mischief, her smile suggesting someone who had learned that the world was a place where people could be trusted to meet her needs with consistency and love. But what made the pictures remarkable wasn't Sophia's obvious health and happiness. It was the way she looked directly at the camera, as if challenging whoever saw the images to doubt that she belonged exactly where she was. Margaret traced Sophia's face in the photograph, remembering the night she had found her crying in Alexander's office, small and helpless and utterly dependent on the kindness of strangers. She looks like she knows exactly who she is. She knows she's loved, Carmen said simply, by 3 adults who figured out how to put her needs ahead of their own fears about what family is supposed to look like. Sophia babbled something that sounded like agreement, then returned her attention to the complex task of getting banana pieces from her tray to her mouth. Around them, the coffee shop continued its afternoon rhythm, other people navigating their own relationship challenges over lattes and pastries. Unaware that at one corner table, 3 adults and a baby were proving that sometimes the most important families are the ones that choose each other against all reasonable expectations. 1 year later, Sophia took her first steps in Margaret's apartment on a Saturday morning, when sunlight streamed through windows that had been enlarged to let in more light and hope than the small space had ever contained. She wobbled across the living room with the determined concentration of someone attempting a feat that required more courage than skill, her arms outstretched for balance and her face bright with the triumph of discovering that the world could be navigated through her own power rather than the goodwill of others. Carmen caught her just before she reached the couch, sweeping her daughter into arms that had grown strong from months of lifting, carrying, and chasing a toddler whose curiosity exceeded her coordination by dangerous margins. Sophia's delighted laughter filled the apartment with the kind of joy that had become the soundtrack to their reconstructed lives. Proof that love could indeed build foundations strong enough to support dreams that had once seemed impossible. Margaret emerged from the kitchen carrying coffee for the adults and a sippy cup for Sophia, moving through her morning routine with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate shared custody schedules, work obligations, and the demands of a child who had opinions about everything from breakfast choices to wardrobe selections. The apartment had evolved to accommodate its expanded population, a crib that converted to a toddler bed, toys that served educational purposes rather than simply occupying attention, and photographs that documented a family's growth in increments too small to notice daily but profound when measured over time. Alexander arrived carrying flowers for Carmen, whose birthday they were celebrating with the kind of low-key festivity that Sophia's attention span could tolerate, and a wrapped package that he set carefully out of reach of small hands that had developed remarkable speed when it came to investigating anything that resembled a present. His visits had become as regular as sunrise, but they no longer carried the awkwardness of charity offered across class divides. He was simply part of the fabric of Sophia's daily life, as essential and unremarkable as morning routines or bedtime stories. She walked, Margaret announced, her voice carrying pride that encompassed more than Sophia's physical development. 4 steps, all by herself like she'd been planning it for weeks. Alexander knelt on the carpet that bore evidence of Sophia's various experiments with food, art supplies, and the natural world she encountered during walks through neighborhoods that had become extended playgrounds. Sophia approached him with the confident waddle of someone who had discovered that legs could be trusted to carry her toward people she wanted to reach, her arms extending for the kind of greeting that adults reserved for family members returning from long absences. "Happy birthday, beautiful girl," Alexander said, though he addressed Carmen rather than Sophia. The baby had commandeered his tie, which had become her favorite toy during his visits, treating the silk fabric as a fascinating puzzle that required constant investigation. Carmen settled beside them on the floor, her nursing scrubs replaced by casual clothes that suggested someone spending a day off with people who mattered more than professional responsibilities. The clinic where she worked had promoted her to supervisor 6 months earlier, recognizing skills in organization and empathy that had been honed through navigating the complex choreography of shared custody and extended family obligations. 25, Carmen said, as if testing the weight of a number that felt simultaneously too young and too old for everything she had experienced. Last year, I thought my life was over. This year, she gestured around Margaret's apartment, which had become the neutral ground where their unusual family gathered for celebrations, holidays, and the kind of ordinary moments that created emotional anchors in lives that had been rebuilt from fragments of dreams that had seemed broken beyond repair. This year you're exactly where you're supposed to be, Margaret finished, speaking with the authority of someone who had learned that sometimes the most important journeys led to destinations that couldn't be mapped by conventional geography. Sophia babbled something that might have been commentary on the adult conversation, or simply practice for the words she would need when her thoughts became too complex for gestures and expressions to convey adequately. She had begun recognizing her own name, responding to simple instructions, and displaying preferences that suggested a personality emerging through the accumulated evidence of daily choices and interactions. Alexander's phone buzzed with messages from a world that continued to operate according to schedules and priorities that had once defined his existence, but now felt distant as photographs from someone else's life. He glanced at the screen, then set the device aside without responding, choosing presence over productivity in ways that would have shocked business associates who knew him only through quarterly reports and board meeting decisions. The foundation is funding 3 new placement programs, he said, referring to changes in his philanthropic focus that had evolved from personal experience rather than tax optimization strategies. Emergency custody protocols that prioritize keeping children with caregivers who formed attachment bonds, regardless of economic status. Carmen looked up from Sophia, who was attempting to interest a stuffed elephant in the complexities of tie pulling. Because of what happened to us. Because what happened to us was wrong in ways that go beyond Victoria's fraud. Systems that prioritize financial resources over emotional attachment create situations where love becomes secondary to economic stability. Sophia should never have been taken from someone who loved her simply because that person cleaned offices instead of owning them. Margaret absorbed this information while Sophia explored the fascinating possibilities presented by shoelaces that remained attached to feet but could be manipulated through patient effort. The sight of a billionaire allowing his expensive shoes to be used as entertainment for a 1-year-old struck her as symbolic of transformations that went beyond policy changes and charitable contributions. "She's made us all better," Margaret observed, speaking the truth that had become evident through months of learning to put Sophia's needs ahead of adult preferences for control, predictability, and emotional safety. Carmen nodded, recognizing that motherhood shared among 3. Adults had required skills in compromise and communication that she had been forced to develop through necessity rather than choice. She's taught us that family doesn't have to look like anything except what works for the people who choose each other. Sophia chose that moment to accomplish her goal of untying Alexander's shoelaces, her victory celebration involving clapping that had been perfected through weeks of practice, and delighted squealing that suggested someone who had learned that personal achievements were worth sharing with people who would appreciate their significance. The afternoon passed in the Badiouan kind of lazy contentment that characterized their best days together, Sophia napping between parents who had learned to coordinate her schedule across 3 different living situations, adults sharing meals that had been prepared collectively, conversation that moved effortlessly between practical concerns and dreams that had been adjusted to accommodate realities that none of them could have anticipated. As evening approached and the celebration wound down with the gentle exhaustion that accompanied successful family gatherings, Sophia fell asleep in Carmen's arms while Alexander and Margaret cleaned up toys that would be redistributed tomorrow according to custody schedules that had become second nature. They moved around each other with the practiced coordination of people who had learned to share space without stepping on toes, metaphorically or literally. The apartment that had once contained only Margaret's careful solitude now held evidence of 3 adults and a child who had figured out how to build something unprecedented from the materials that life had provided, rather than waiting for circumstances to match their original expectations. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its endless energy, millions of people pursuing dreams that had been carefully planned or accidentally discovered. But inside, Margaret's apartment, which now smelled of coffee and baby powder and the particular warmth that came from love that had been tested by truth and chosen to survive, 4 people settled into the evening rhythm of a family that had been constructed through courage rather than convenience. Sophia slept with the complete trust of someone who had learned that the adults in her life could be counted on to be there when she woke, that love came in different forms but always came, that family meant the people who showed up consistently rather than the ones who shared genetic material. And in the gathering darkness of a city that never slept, 3 adults who had been strangers 18 months earlier watched over the child who had taught them that sometimes the most important families are the ones that choose each other against all reasonable expectations, build themselves from fragments of broken dreams, and prove that love really can be enough to create everything else that matters.